Hello, everyone. Welcome, one and all. This is the Do Dissidents podcast. My name is Keaton Weiss. I am doing a little solo recording today on Easter Sunday. Probably be out tomorrow on Monday. I don't know. I'm not religious. I know there's Good Friday, Easter Sunday. Is Monday is the Monday after Easter called anything? Should I know? I put my garbage out on the curb Friday, not even remembering that it was Good Friday. And so I looked out in the early afternoon and the garbage hadn't come. And my wife said, "Oh, yeah, of course. It's Good Friday." So, anyway, I don't know if Monday marks any special post Easter holiday. If it does, whatever it is, I hope you have a happy one. But I'm here to do a little bit of a solo recording only because we're going to do a little reading today, something that never really done in any type of long form sort of way. And we did an episode just recently, a sort of post mortem on the Bernie campaign. But there was an article that came out just a couple days ago, in fact, on Good Friday, in Politico called "No One Went for a Knockout Blow Inside Bernie's Campaign Nosedive" by Holly Otterbein. I'm going to read that article in its entirety, and I'm going to stop at certain points and offer some commentary. And I think it's an important article to read, and that's why I'm going to read it for you guys so that you don't have to and offer some insights of mine. Now, before you say, "Oh, it's Politico, it's junk, it's fake, it's bullshit," look, very few people hate this publication more than I do, but that doesn't mean that everything you read in there is false, okay? There are several people from the Sanders campaign quoted in this article, some anonymously, some not anonymously. Faz Shakir, the campaign manager, is quoted in here, as is Jane Sanders. Okay, so if you will not trust a word that I read now, then I guess I can't stop you from turning this episode off. But there is some stuff in here that I think it's important to understand and go through. So we'll start now. It was late February, and Bernie Sanders was days away from the most important debate of his political career. The Vermont senator had finally clawed his way to the top of the presidential primary after winning New Hampshire and crushing the field in Nevada. His closest rival, Joe Biden, was reeling. Moderate Democrats were terrified Sanders could win the nomination, and the target on his back was bigger than ever before. Two of Sanders' top advisors, pollster Ben Tolchin and speechwriter David Sirota, told Sanders that he should pointedly take on Biden at the February 25th debate in South Carolina, which the former vice president saw as his firewall state. They also said Sanders should use billionaire Mike Bloomberg as a foil and attack him over his record of supporting stop and frisk in order to deflect from the onslaught he would no doubt face as the newly anointed frontrunner. The stakes were high. In an email to senior staff, Tolchin said that moderate voters were beginning to unify behind Biden and that the consolidation would intensify if he won South Carolina, according to people familiar with the message. Okay, so they saw this consolidation coming even before South Carolina. It wasn't just that South Carolina took them by surprise and then this last minute thing happened. What this article claims is that these pollsters saw this coming even before South Carolina, which was reflected in some of the public polling, as Biden was making gains in the polls leading up to that. And I think part of that had to do with Mike Bloomberg's horrible debate performance the week prior. Anyway, moving on. But on stage that night, Sanders didn't take his aide's advice. Instead, he largely gave Biden a pass, bashed Bloomberg sometimes, but not over stop and frisk, and mostly stuck to his standard talking points. It wasn't the first nor the last time Sanders eschewed his staffers' suggestions to be more aggressive with his top rival. Their warnings proved prescient. Biden went on to sweep the day in South Carolina, unify moderates, and then carry Super Tuesday. Quote, "Knocking out Biden was job number one, and even when he was down, no one went for a knockout blow," said a top aide. That was the problem. Sanders' unwillingness to go for Biden's jugular is just one of the decisions campaign aides are wrestling with since he exited the primary on Wednesday. Despite being the best fundraiser in the Democratic field, having near universal name ID, and leading a massive volunteer army, Sanders performed worse in many ways in 2020 than in 2016. He badly lost among African Americans yet again, and the rural and working class white voters who were with him 4 years ago abandoned him. See, that is, once again, just a little bit of trolling by Politico. You could say he performed worse. Again, this was a much different type of race than it was in 2016. There were a number of factors that made it so. I don't want to go into that now, but I wouldn't say as a blanket statement that he performed worse this time than last time. According to interviews with more than 20 of Sanders' aides, surrogates, and top allies, many believe he should have been more aggressive in taking on Biden, including over the idea that he was more electable in November. They also complained about the campaign's organizing strategy and its inability to win over black and senior voters. Though nearly everyone in Sanders' circle felt that the media and political establishments played critical roles in taking him down, they still think the nomination was in his reach. Quote, sadly, we did not get to a place of convincing a large number of people that he was the most quote unquote electable choice, Faz Shakir, Sanders' campaign manager, told Politico this week. It turned into a superficial media perception of safe, electable Biden versus the revolutionary Bernie Sanders, and I think that dynamic kind of hurt. It's difficult to remember now, but Sanders was once seen as unstoppable. After winning Nevada, where he won 50% of Latino voters and finished only 10 points behind Biden among black voters, moderate Democrats panicked that Sanders would roll into Super Tuesday with unrelenting momentum. And since he had shown significant strength among voters of color, they worried he might even take South Carolina. Instead, Sanders lost there by 29 percentage points. In an epic display of political strength and coordination, moderates then rushed to consolidate behind Biden, a feat capped by his rivals Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar dropping out and endorsing him. Yeah, that really is, I think, the whole race right there. All right, now that's not to say you can't Monday morning quarterback certain things, but that last minute maneuvering happens right as Joe Biden got, and I don't know if I'm cheating here, if I'm skipping ahead or whatever. I don't think so. I think it was another publication that pointed this out, that between Joe Biden's victory in South Carolina and Super Tuesday, Biden received, and this was partly because of Obama sort of making this happen uh, behind the scenes. We know he called Pete Buttigieg and had something to do, if not everything to do, with his decision to drop out and endorse Biden. But in any event, Biden received an estimated $72 million in earned media coverage, all of which was positive, between the Saturday South Carolina vote and Super Tuesday. $72 million in free media, which means that it didn't matter as much as perhaps it should have that Biden had no campaign operation, that he had no fundraising, that he had no ground game, right? He got all that free media coverage, $72 million in 72 hours, right? We're talking about the polls closing at 7 p.m. on Saturday night. And then from Saturday night to Sunday night was 24 hours. Sunday night to Monday night, there's another 24 hours. So that's 48, plus actually less than 72 hours, because by the time the polls opened on Super Tuesday, what's that, 48 plus 60 hours. So he got about $1.2 million per hour of free media between Saturday night and Tuesday morning. And that to me is the race. Because and this becomes once again a problem of voters, right? Because the voters in the Democratic Party overwhelmingly trust the corporate media. 70% of them. Okay? Now, the reason this was not as big a problem for Trump in the Republican primary 4 years ago is because most Republican voters hate the media. And so if Trump gets 72 hours of lousy media before Super Tuesday, which he did, right? And it was his own fault. I mean, he went on I think it was Good Morning America, and refused to denounce the KKK right before Super Tuesday, right? So it's not like that was undeserved bad media, right? I'm not saying that, but what I'm saying is that he got all that bad media and it didn't hurt him. Why? Because Republican voters don't give a fuck what the media has to say, and Democratic voters do. Okay, so I don't want to lose sight of that. All right, we can Monday morning quarterback this thing all we want. At the end of the day, That stands out as the deciding factor. All right. But there are a lot of other mistakes that this campaign made that need to be avoided in future campaigns if we're going to run them successfully, which is why I'm doing this recording. All right. But I don't want to lose sight of that. That to me still is number one. I've made that point before. I just wanted to clear that up once again, lest people think that this is a bizarre reading for me to be doing. Why am I reading a Politico article? All right, here we go. Moving on. Some Sanders aides think he should have used the period between Nevada and South Carolina to appear presidential and broaden his appeal, including to seniors. That was the idea behind a sit-down interview he did with Anderson Cooper on 60 Minutes. Instead, he spent much of his time doubling down on defending positive comments he made in the 1980s about Cuban dictator Fidel Castro's education program. Okay, now this is one of the things that pisses me off. Okay? Let me just briefly read this paragraph. Some Sanders aides think he should have used a period, blah, blah, blah. Okay, the idea behind doing a sit-down interview with Anderson Cooper on 60 Minutes, according to his campaign staff, was to make him look presidential and broaden his appeal. Now, the way that would have happened is if you had a fair shake on 60 Minutes. But I don't understand. These campaign aides don't know that when you sit down for an interview with Anderson Cooper on 60 Minutes, right after becoming the frontrunner for the nomination, that he's going to try to stick a knife in your back? Like, what did they think? Did they honestly think that this was going to be an opportunity to sit down and have a nice conversation and learn what a nice old man Bernie Sanders is, get to really, get really up close and personal with our next president? Did they actually think that that was the angle that 60 Minutes was going to take, or that Anderson Cooper was going to take? One of the themes of this write-up and one of the key takeaways from this write-up here is that Bernie himself and too many people in his inner circle were just way too naive and too blindsided by just how deep the hatred of him is among the corporate media and the corporate Democrats. I mean, if I were on his campaign, I would say there is no fucking way you are sitting down with Anderson Cooper right now. If you do, I quit. Of course, they're going to pull that Castro card out of the deck. If it wasn't that, it would have been something else. Of course, they're going to try to shiv you in that interview. It made no sense to do it in the first place. All right, and now, after they bring up the Castro thing, all right, here we go. Aide said that weakened his case, meaning trying to argue in favor of the Cuban literacy program. That weakened his case on the single most important issue to Democratic voters, beating President Donald Trump. Some suggested he strongly condemn the Cuban regime and get off the subject quickly. He didn't take their advice and instead drew out the exchange at the South Carolina debate, arguing that, quote, Cuba, Nicaragua, authoritarianism, of any stripe is bad, close quote, but that former President Barack Obama had also praised the Cuba's educational program. He actually went beyond that and started to do the thing where, he said just because a dictator does something doesn't mean that something is bad. We've talked about this on the podcast before. I'm not going to go on and on about this. I think he's right on the substance of what he said about Cuba and the education program and all that stuff. I think a week before Super Tuesday is the dumbest time to try and win that argument, especially when, as the article points out, this weakened his case on the single most important issue to the electorate, which you knew for a year going in that this was a scared, weak electorate who just only wants to beat Donald Trump. They would vote. You could run Dick Cheney in this election if the Democratic primary electorate thought, if God spoke to them and said, Cheney will beat Trump, I promise you. Okay? He's the guy you got to nominate. They would go for him. That's how fucked up these voters are, okay? But that's how scared they are of Trump, and that's how desperate they are to beat him. And 24 hours after becoming the front runner, when you are known as a high-risk candidate, it is absolutely idiotic to pick that point in time to try and win an argument about the Cuba Literacy Brigade. All right, reading on. Quote, should we have spent basking in the sun of our Nevada win by talking about Fidel Castro? Not what I would have done, said one aide. Should we have used that time to really open up and become a much bigger tent, or were we focused on continuing to shore up the progressive vote? Okay, so again, what was the rhyme and reason behind going on 60 Minutes in the first place? Some staffers believe Sanders also should have done more to break through on electability, an issue was even more important to older and African American voters among who he was weakest. He never conducted focus groups on the issue, or any issue, because of a dislike of such campaign tactics, Aide said. A few top advisors felt that Sanders would be seen as more electable once he won early states, and that the matter would take care of itself, while others argued that the campaign should have more directly made the case. Yeah, I wrote a little piece back when we were in Facebook jail in October, so it didn't get as much reach as it should have. That he needed to start making that case much sooner because the polling data said all along that that was the number one issue among voters. And so, yeah, it makes sense to emphasize that all throughout the campaign. Here's one of the ways in which they could have done that. It says right here in the article. One option they said worked well at the doorsteps was arguing that when Democrats nominated quote unquote safe establishment choices, such as Hillary Clinton and John Kerry, they lost, and that Biden was the latest in a long line of mainstream nominees whose appearance as a sure winner was a mirage. But instead, the candidate typically used his go to lines on the subject that he defeated Trump in nearly every poll, and winning in November would require unprecedented turnout and excitement, which failed to stick. Not much to add there. Jane Sanders, the senator's wife and closest advisor, acknowledged there was more they could have done to persuade people that he was as electable as Biden. The facts were on our side, she said. We didn't do it well enough. That is something we should have done better. Bernie Sanders had expected to spend more time in South Carolina, where African Americans cast more than half the vote in the Democratic primaries in the weeks before the primary there. But the senator had to scale those plans back due to the impeachment proceedings, said people familiar with his schedule. Some of Sanders' advisors and allies felt that especially hurt him because he tended to do better with voters who saw him up close. Quote, we've got to do better at building relationships with the African American community, said Ro Khanna, Sanders' campaign co-chair of the progressive movement. I don't think we have done enough. Jamal Green, a former Sanders surrogate, said that while the senator brought on a more diverse group of aides than in 2016, and his 2020 team included African American advisors such as campaign co-chair Nina Turner and National Press Secretary Brianna Joy Gray, Sanders needed additional senior black staffers. The problem was in 2016 and 2020, he had some of the same top aides that made the campaign make some wrong decisions, he said. I guess that was a Ro Khanna quote as well. Oh, no, I'm sorry. That was uh, Jamal Green. There wasn't enough money put into talking to black older voters who didn't have an opinion on Bernie or didn't like Bernie. Around the same time that Biden was consolidating moderates behind him, Sanders attempted to bring the progressive wing of the party fully behind him. He talked to Warren over the phone multiple times after she dropped out. See, this is the part of the article that's the most infuriating to me and the most frustrating. Let me just start this paragraph again. Around the same time that Biden was consolidating moderates behind him, Sanders attempted to bring the progressive wing of the party fully behind him. He talked to Warren over the phone multiple times after she dropped out after Super Tuesday, a top aide said. He asked for her endorsement as well as for a nod from Andrew Yang and Tom Steyer, the staffer said. In parentheses, Yang said Sanders called the night I suspended, congratulated me, and invited me to meet with him, but did not directly request an endorsement. None of those three threw their weight behind him. Quote, he was deeply disappointed that she, meaning Warren, didn't endorse afterward, said a person familiar with his talks with Warren. It made him question her progressivism. Now, maybe that was temporary, but I think he was very hurt by that because he would have endorsed her in a heartbeat if it was the other way around. That is the most frustrating part of the article for a number of reasons. Number one, I knew there was no chance in hell that Warren was going to endorse Bernie Sanders at any point. I knew that. I said that on this show. After Super Tuesday, we did our Super Tuesday recap. Russell and I were talking. Russell said we're going to see what Warren is made of by who she endorses. And I said, look, it's not going to happen. She's not going to endorse Bernie Sanders. I knew she wasn't going to endorse him. Why didn't he know that? Why didn't anybody on the campaign know that? Why do I know that? And none of these people who are getting paid thousands of dollars a week to run this campaign know that. Why didn't he know that? Why didn't Jane know that? Once again, there's a naivete about just how stacked against him the deck was from day one. And I'm sorry, you have a responsibility to be more cognizant of that when you are leading a movement of people who are really relying on you to win. I mean, this goes back to that town hall. He did a town hall in Iowa. It was a healthcare town hall. And the campaign made a great video out of that. It was a very moving video where these people showed up in tears. They were desperate. They were drowning in medical debt. Some of them were still sick and undergoing treatment. And these people are telling him, listen, no pressure, Bernie, but you're our only hope. We need you to win. And so when people are depending on you in that way, and that's not to say that every, presidential candidate doesn't face enormous pressure from their supporters, obviously. But in this case, when you have people coming to you and saying, we need you because you're the only one speaking to these issues that directly affect us in a material way, sometimes in a life and death way, I'm sorry. You have a responsibility to be sharper than this. How could you be surprised that Elizabeth Warren was leaving you high and dry? Okay? As far as, and that's when you questioned her progressivism? It made him question her progressivism? I mean, come on. Come on. I'm sorry, that's bullshit. That's absolute bullshit. You know when I started to question Elizabeth Warren's progressivism? When she sat out the 2016 primary 4 fucking years ago. Is when I questioned the progressivism of Elizabeth Warren. In case you still were holding out hope for her, I mean, there were signs all throughout this campaign, backtracking on Medicare for All as soon as she found out that Nancy Pelosi wasn't going to have it. All right, that was one in a long series. Saying that Bernie was instructing his supporters to trash her because a phone script leaked that made some very modest and mild criticisms about her from an electability standpoint. And then the day after that, of course, the big one, a lie, a total, complete lie that he told her a woman couldn't win. How you could expect anything from her past that point, I'm sorry, you have your head up your ass. If you held out any hope that she would ever do the right thing from that point on. Not only did he apparently still hold out hope that she would somehow come around to him and endorse him and throw her weight behind him when it mattered, but even in the wake of that, when his supporters got rightfully furious with her and started putting, hold on, I'm sorry, started putting snake emojis, snakes, cartoon snakes on her Twitter feed. Snakes on her Twitter feed. The reason they put snakes on her Twitter feed is because she's a snake. Because she's a lying, backstabbing snake. That's why we put snakes on her Twitter feed. We were totally justified in putting snakes on her feed. We were totally justified in calling her a despicable, low-life, degenerate liar, because that is exactly what she is. And when we did that, Bernie reprimanded us. This guy spent more time reprimanding his own supporters than he spent criticizing his opponents. I will repeat that because it bears repeating. Bernie spent more time reprimanding his own supporters who were depending on him to win this fucking thing than he spent criticizing his opponents. That's no good. I love the guy. I'm proud to say I supported this campaign as much as I could, but that sucks. All right, moving on. Some staffers said the campaign's polling made a bad situation worse. A Tolchin survey showed a close race in South Carolina in the weeks before the primary. At one point, Sanders grew so frustrated with Tolchin's polling that he considered moving polling in-house, said an aide. In total, Sanders' team reported knocking on more doors and calling more voters than any other candidate in the race. And yet he still lost to Biden, who didn't even campaign in some states where he coasted to victory. That lopsidedness had led to soul searching among some progressives about the value of field organizing. But some Sanders aides argue that the impressive voter contact numbers the campaign released concealed deep disagreements over organizing. It doesn't get too much into this. I'll just read one more paragraph here on this subject. Some senior staffers were skeptical about the organizing team's experiments. Iowa aides said they mostly stopped using the Burn app, an organizing tool made in house, for some time because it wasn't fully developed and lacked precinct matching information. Staff also complained that some canvassing scripts in the days before primaries were focused on persuasion for undecided voters instead of solely getting out the vote. All right, so a couple things to say here. Number one, as for any disagreements over the power and importance of organizing, I am on the side that field organizing is tremendously important. It is why he did as well as he did in Iowa, New Hampshire, and Nevada. It's why Pete Buttigieg did as well as Pete did in Iowa and New Hampshire. Pete had a very impressive ground game in both of those states, which we're going to get to in a second, not directly, but there's another point in here about the Iowa organizing. All right, so it's not a question of organizing being unimportant. It's a question of whether or not organizing on its own is sufficient. And apparently, that's not the case, especially once again in a Democratic primary where 70% of the voters are under the influence of Rachel Maddow and Chuck Todd and Wolf Blitzer and Chris Hayes and Sidney Ember and the fucking, whoever writes the Washington Post, Jennifer Rubin, Jonathan Chait, New York Magazine. I mean, they believe in these people and they trust them and they listen to them. And so when you get 72 hours, 72 million dollars worth of free media from these people, worth of gushing press coverage in 60 hours between the time the polls close in South Carolina and the time the polls open on Super Tuesday, that can overcome a good organizing operation. That is not to say that an organizing operation is not important. It's just to say that you need more. You need a more ruthless, a more aggressive, and a more aware inner circle in your campaign. And you need to be more aware yourself, quite frankly, of just how hated you are by those people, just how much they despise you, just how threatened they are by you and your movement. There are times when Bernie seems to understand that, but then there are decisions that were made in this campaign, exposed by this article, that suggests that he didn't understand that nearly to the degree that it was necessary to. Okay, so that's just a general word on the virtue of organizing. In terms of this last sentence here, staff also complained that some canvassing scripts in the days before primaries were focused on persuasion for undecided voters instead of solely getting out the vote. Yeah, I heard that from a number of people as well, including my father, who actually went to Iowa, and he actually made a trip down to South Carolina as well to canvass in the days before the vote. And he got pissed off at the South Carolina office to the point where he actually left earlier than he was going to because he felt it was a waste of time. They were sending him to houses of people who didn't even know there was a primary going on. The phone banking was going out to people who, like I said, either didn't know there was a primary or were undecided, and they were having to persuade people. And, what he mentioned to me when I talked to him about this, and what makes total sense, is that isn't that the point of doing all this organizing a year in advance? Like, they had 1 million volunteers signed up within the first 2 weeks of the campaign. They were making a ton of phone calls, right? I mean, it wasn't like they weren't doing anything. They were doing plenty. Isn't the point of making those phone calls early to identify committed Bernie voters so that a few days before you actually have to turn the vote out, you're calling the people who you know are going to support Bernie Sanders? I also ran into that. I did as much phone banking as I could. And when I was phone banking into Iowa, it was for the Sunrise Movement because the campaign already had, they said, too many phone bankers. And so I still wanted to help get the vote out in Iowa. So I campaigned through Sunrise and I reached some undecided voters that way. But I figured, all right, that's not on the campaign. This is an outside group with their own list. But then I did realize that when I would phone bank more going into, New Hampshire, South Carolina, that, yeah, it was weird. Like, why am I talking to undecided people right now in crunch time? All right, moving on here. At a meeting with top aides before the Iowa caucuses, a few months before the Iowa caucuses, senior advisor Chuck Rocha, or Rocha, not sure, heard it pronounced both ways, not sure which is the correct one, raised concerns about the fact that they had lacked precinct captains for hundreds of caucus sites in the state. Some staffers felt that was partly due to the fact that they required captains to go through in depth training. On the day of the Iowa caucuses, while the vast majority of caucus sites were covered, the campaign had no precinct captains in some rural areas, said several aides. Quote, "We had a lot of last minute work in shipping out of state volunteers to act as precinct captains in rural areas," said an Iowa Sanders staffer. This is key. Buttigieg's ultimate victory in rural parts of the state helped him run up the delegate score and win Iowa, right? Win, I would put that in quotes. Politico's not, for obvious reasons. All right. But either way, this was a strength of Buttigieg that he was competitive statewide in these more rural areas, which didn't have as many people in them. But just like in an electoral college situation where rural states have disproportionate representation, it's the case that these rural areas in Iowa can still be significant delegate baskets if you win enough of them and in large numbers. All right. Reading on. Claire Sandberg, Sanders' national organizing director, felt that campaign leadership should have hired more field staff earlier in 2019 across states, including Iowa, according to a person familiar with her thinking. Others said that Sanders should have visited more rural areas there. A planned campaign swing in rural Iowa was scrapped because of impeachment. Look, the impeachment thing was total fucking bullshit. Okay, I would not put it past Democratic leadership to at least think that a perk of impeachment is taking Bernie off the trail. All right, but the fact of the matter is, you could see that coming months in advance. All right. And so that's not the kind of thing that you can't prepare for. We knew impeachment was in the offing. You knew it was going to take you off the trail. That campaign swing could have happened earlier. Right. So you don't want to blame that whole thing on impeachment. Although impeachment, look, you know, in a state that you lost by what, 2/10 of 1 point in terms of the delegate count, even though he won the popular vote. Yeah, impeachment made a difference. Absolutely. Conflict between senior aides and the organizing operation culminated in February when Sandberg was layered by Misty Rebick. Never heard that name, so I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. The former Iowa State director, who was named the team's national director of organizing and field. Even critics of the organizing program concede that the best run field operation can only move a few points in a close race, but Sanders lost to Biden by double digits in at least a dozen states. Okay, so that's moving past Iowa. Many in the campaign partly blame cable TV for that. Oh, so okay, so this was in this article. With the media tracking service Critical Mention estimating that Biden enjoyed, once again, I mentioned this earlier, nearly $72 million in almost completely positive earned media in the days between South Carolina and Super Tuesday. Once again, the days between South Carolina and Super Tuesday, 2 days. 2 days. That's $1.2 million per hour. But some of Sanders' aides and allies also think they could have done a better job handling the press. All right, here we go. They think the campaign should have had more surrogates on MSNBC and other cable news channels. This is another infuriating part of the article here, so get ready. Staffers were also told at times not to pitch opposition research on rivals, a standard job for the communications shop on most campaigns. Once again, staffers were also told at times not to pitch opposition research on rivals, a standard job for the communications shop on most campaigns, due to the fact that Sanders disliked negative campaigning. Okay, I'll stop right there for 1 second. Once again, I go back to the people who showed up to that healthcare town hall in crippling medical debt who said, you got to win. You're our only hope here. I don't give a flying fuck whether you like negative campaigning or not. You have to do what it takes to win because your supporters are counting on you. Okay? Give a goddamn whether you fucking like it or not. Anyway, uh, and Sanders sometimes rebuffed the press. According to an MSNBC spokesperson, the network had a long standing invitation for Sanders to participate in a town hall, but he declined. That I don't so much fault the campaign for. I don't think the key is necessarily to engage these media people who hate you, right? I mean, that was my point about how he shouldn't have gone on 60 Minutes. Fuck them and their town halls. What, you're going to sit across from who? Chris Matthews? What would his first question be to you in this? So how is your campaign analogous to the Nazi invasion of France? Right? No. I mean, I don't blame them for not going on and doing MSNBC town halls. That I don't actually fault them for. And I don't fault them for this next part either. Some of Sanders' allies felt he should have brought on longtime professionals who knew and could better deal with the mainstream media. Quote, he needed to hire somebody who could talk to the corporate media and could call in favors, said a surrogate. Okay, no. No, you can't fault them for that. Look, you're not going to call in favors. They are your enemy, right? I mean, and apparently, whoever gave that quote didn't understand it. Maybe that was one of the putzes who said you should go on 60 Minutes, right? Again, there are people who don't understand. The corporate media is the enemy. They are going to destroy you. Their goal is to destroy you. You are not going to fair shake. I don't care how many favors you call in or who you know. You could know Phil Griffin's wife and call in a favor. It ain't going to happen. Now here's some more stuff. Sanders' team zeroed in on the liberal network MSNBC early on in the campaign as a particular problem. Even more than CNN or Fox News, his aides felt that its pundits were extremely negative and unfair towards Sanders. Obviously. I said that obviously part. Over the summer, Sanders and his top brass sat down with network president Phil Griffin in what MSNBC described as an off-the-record editorial board meeting. Quote, I thought we walked out of there without a good common understanding, said Shakir, the campaign manager. My big point to them was that this is Bernie Sanders, the human being. This is not the angry, yelling, finger up in the air Bernie Sanders as you guys often portray. Here he is, the human being. But any optimism was short-lived. It just didn't feel like it ever fundamentally changed, said Shakir. We tried that approach. Didn't change. No shit didn't change. Well, they're owned by Comcast. They're not going to give Bernie a fair shake no matter what you do. Ed Schultz, the late great Ed Schultz, had a show on MSNBC. He went to cover Bernie's campaign launch in 2015 in Burlington. When Bernie was announcing that he was running for president, he had a campaign rally. Schultz was there covering it. He had a little crew there, whatever. He got a call from Phil Griffin saying, we're not covering this. Ed Schultz was, he said, what do you mean we're not covering this? He's declaring his candidacy for the presidential nomination. How can we not cover this? He says, we're not doing it. Schultz did it anyway. A few weeks later, he was fired. I mean, what? And like, why take a meeting with them? Why engage them at all? And it's not just a matter of engaging them. It's a matter of not understanding who your deadly enemies are. I mean, it's one thing, you want to say, okay, we took a meeting. I don't think you should even take a meeting. But you keep going on. Like, how could you go on 60 Minutes? And I know 60 Minutes is not MSNBC, all right? But the point is you have to be able to see the big picture here. You know how against you they are. So how could a campaign who realized this early on then think, hey, I know what we should do right after we become the front runners. Let's have an hour-long sit-down with some New World Order hatchet man from the corporate media who's going to try his best to stick it in our back as far as he can. I mean, it makes no sense. It just makes no sense. I don't understand the logic. I don't understand how you connect those two things. We have a campaign meeting, or we have a sort of off-the-record editorial board meeting, as the article mentions here. Early on in the campaign, we walk out of that room realizing it's not going to work out. And then, right after we win Nevada and become the prohibitive frontrunners, hey, why not sit down with one of these same types of people and give them 1 hour to take shot after shot after shot? Makes no sense. I don't understand it. I don't understand how you can have an inner circle that is this confused about something that is so non-confusing. It is as clear as could possibly be that the corporate media, whether it is CNN, whether it is MSNBC, whether it is the Washington Post, or the New York Times, or any of them, CBS, ABC, right? Any of them. It is crystal clear to anyone, much less top-level, highly paid campaign advisors, that they are bad actors intent on destroying you and your campaign. I don't understand how that cannot inform all of your decisions regarding how to handle the media, interact with the media, or not interact with the media. Just doesn't make sense to me. Mike Koska, an experienced operative who had worked for Bill de Blasio and Sanders in 2016, was brought on board in September as the communications director to improve the operation, and he became a respected figure among the press corps that covered Sanders. In August, Sanders' campaign also talked with his former TV ad firm, Divine Mulvey Longabach. Man, these are some names here. About returning. In addition to being behind the famous 2016 spot America, that was the Simon and Garfunkel ad there, the business had served as a link between the Sanders movement and more mainstream Democrats and the press. But an aide said Sanders balked at what he saw as too steep a price, leading him to believe that the firm was more concerned with money than the cause. It was Bernie's campaign that reached back out to us, said Mark Longabaugh, a partner at the business. We put a pretty standard contract on the table. It was not out of bounds in any way. It was in fact a smaller commission than we actually received in 2016. Despite the campaign's attempt to deal with MSNBC, the network's hosts and pundits blasted Sanders the day he won the Nevada caucuses, the type of campaign development that might have resulted in other candidates winning a slew of positive media. Yes, this was the first time that any candidate had won the popular vote in Iowa, New Hampshire, and Nevada. Had any other candidate had those results in the first three contests, the media, all right, would have been leading the charge to coalesce behind that candidate and push everybody else out of the race. In this case, they did the complete opposite. Again, because they hate Bernie, they hate the Bernie movement, and they will stop at nothing to crush it. Chris Matthews compared Sanders' victory in the caucuses to the Nazi invasion of France. Back to the article now. James Carville said a Sanders nomination would be political suicide and that Russian President Vladimir Putin was, quote, the happiest person right now about the news. Again, yes, this is a media problem. But again, who is your fucking audience? Who is your fucking voter base that works? That this little freak from the swamps of New Orleans comes up there and says, oh, Vladimir Putin is having a great night right now. And people think, oh, yeah, that's right. You know, he's right. Putin wants to sow division in the country to help Trump. And Bernie is divisive. And so Putin must be happy right now. What a pathetic, weak bunch of fucking people. This is the argument for a third party. You can't share a political space with these imbeciles. Vladimir Putin. Back to the article. The media between Nevada and Super Tuesday was more negative than anybody could have ever anticipated, said Jane Sanders. That's something I hope the media would look at. Let me read this again. This is another infuriating quote. The media between Nevada and Super Tuesday was more negative than anybody could have ever anticipated? Than anybody could have ever anticipated? You know who anticipated it? I did. You know who anticipated it? Everybody I talked to. You know who also anticipated it? Jacobin Magazine wrote an article. It's gonna get bad. Everyone in your movement knew this was coming. You didn't know this was coming? worse than we could have ever anticipated? I mean, what is wrong with you? Then she goes on. That's something I hope the media would look at. No, the media is not going to look at it because the media is the enemy. What can you not? This is what pisses me off. This is Jane Sanders. That's something I hope the media would look. The media between Nevada and Super Tuesday was more negative than anybody could have ever anticipated. And that's something I hope the media would look at. Where the fuck have you been the last 5 years? I'm sorry. I don't mean any disrespect. I'm sure Jane Sanders is a lovely woman. But what the fuck kind of statement is that? I'm sorry, it is negligent. It is political malpractice to be of the mindset that we can't anticipate the wave of negative press that is coming when we become the front runner. Are you fucking kidding me? It's just irresponsible. Again, I'm going to mention this a third or fourth time. I don't know how many times I've mentioned. Think of the people in that medical town hall who are counting on you, and you don't see this coming. Really, really disappointing there. Again, I love Bernie. I'm sure Jane is a wonderful person. But that's a fuck up. I mean, that's infuriating. Especially since you guys come after your own supporters for defending you against these media ghouls. When we hit them back on your behalf, you tell us we have to watch our tone. And then you come out with a statement right after you lose that the media coverage between Nevada and Super Tuesday was more negative than anybody could have ever anticipated? I mean, that's absurd. Absolutely fucking absurd. Shakir contacted Griffin after the show and demanded an apology for Matthews' remarks, which Sanders was deeply offended by as a Jewish man whose families died in the Holocaust. Matthews admitted on air it was a mistake and later parted ways with MSNBC on the eve of Super Tuesday, but by then the damage had been done. That's the end of the article. You know, at a Bernie rally, whether this was right before Super Tuesday or after, I think it had to be before at some point. Because it was right at the time when, you know, they were bringing that Bernie bro narrative back, which if I remember correctly was, right between Nevada and Super Tuesday, when Jane Sanders didn't think that the media was going to get nasty. At a rally, neo-Nazis unfurled a swastika flag at a Bernie rally. You know how much coverage that got on the mainstream news networks? None. But the Bernie bros, right? The Bernie bros, such as, you know, young women who beg for insulin money every week and get upset when the liars in the media trash Medicare for all, you know, those Bernie bros, when they get angry and they tweet angrily back at these media people, or when they, God forbid, put a snake cartoon on Elizabeth Warren's Facebook page, Bernie and his campaign comes after us saying we need to watch it. Meanwhile, this same media who complains, who plays the victim, right? Chuck Todd calling us brown shirts, right? And it's just the tip of the iceberg. All these media people, you know, Meghan McCain crying on air about how hurt her feelings are by the mean Bernie people. Whoopi Goldberg comes to her defense, tells AOC, you know, Bernie really needs to tamp it down. Meanwhile, a fucking swastika flag is unfurled at a Bernie rally. None of these people have anything to say about it. That's what you're dealing with. And to be that naive to it the whole time, to the point where after you lose, you can give a quote like that, I'm sorry. That is a huge, huge, huge dereliction of duty. Just is. So that's the article. And that's about what I got to say about this campaign. Again, I think there were this article really revealed some big mistakes, some things that should have been done differently. And I thought it was important to get that off my chest and hash that out and hopefully put it in a way that you guys could get some value from. You know, none of this is to say that Bernie is a sellout or that Bernie is a loser or that Bernie is an idiot. Look, every campaign makes mistakes. These were some of the mistakes were made. The point of this is to learn from this moving forward. And also to, tell some truths that need to be told. To just say that the whole thing was rigged against us from the start is not productive because when we say that, right, that is, I mean, it's not analogous because there's a lot more truth to it than there is in the other case that I'm about to make. It's a lot like the I'm with her morons complaining that Russia ruined it for their candidate. Again, it's not the same, but it can lead to a similar effect, which is that we don't look within ourselves and within our campaign and within our efforts to realize where we fell short and how we have to improve. And look, a lot of this, by the way, was not on us. A lot of this was on the campaign. Like, I mean, one of the themes of this recording, I'm just realizing now as we're approaching an hour, is that a lot of this stuff that we're pointing out where the campaign, was blind or caught off guard, a lot of us in the grassroots were on this page the whole time. We knew the media couldn't be trusted. We knew the corporate Democrats couldn't be trusted. We knew Elizabeth Warren couldn't be trusted. It seems like the people who get paid to know this shit didn't know this shit. And it seems like Bernie himself either didn't know it or was reluctant to admit it or thought that it was better to just let it slide. And like I said, this campaign, for all the mistakes that were made, some of which were outlined just now, I'll make a baseball comparison since it should be the beginning of baseball season now. They say the manager of a baseball team has done his job when he gets the ball to the closer with a lead. The closer, for those who don't follow baseball, is the relief pitcher whose job it is to come in the ninth inning and get 3 outs and lock down the game, seal the win. And I think you could make that comparison. They had a lead going into Super Tuesday. They went into Super Tuesday the favorites. You could say they got the ball to the closer. And ultimately, that establishment maneuvering was just too much to overcome. And that, by the way, is the case for an electoral organization, or at the very least, in the short term, an institution or an infrastructure of some organizational clout that can exist outside the Democratic Party, because otherwise we are too at the mercy of a machine that is merciless towards us. And we can't allow that dynamic to continue. Thank you so much for listening. You can follow us on SoundCloud, subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Apple, Spotify, Google Play, Stitcher, and CastBox, TuneIn Radio. We're on all the major podcast players. We've had a few of you guys sign up for the Patreon recently. Much appreciated. Those of you who have, it is a huge help, especially in times like these. So if you would like to support the show for as little as $3 a month, that's just a dime a day, you can go to patreon.com/Jew Dissidents, who have some exclusive content that we've uploaded to there in recent days. And so if you can do that, once again, patreon.com/Jew Dissidents. Thank you so much for your support. When these primaries do get going again, like I said, I encourage you all to go to localberniecrats.com and find some candidates who you can support down ballot. That is still a very important thing to be doing. My home state of New York, which votes June 23rd, which hopefully has the presidential primary. Andrew Cuomo's trying to get rid of the presidential primary now. But whether he does or not, there's still going to be down ballot primaries. Lauren Ashcraft is a local Berniecrat. She's fantastic. I've heard her interviewed all over the place. She's great. She's running in New York City in the 12th district, which is an interesting district. That's basically almost all of the east side of Manhattan. Plus, I think Williamsburg and Greenpoint are in that district as well. Robin Wilt running for Congress. Isaiah James, he's another more high-profile candidate there. He's running for Congress in New York's 9th District. And then there are some other candidates as well running for federal and state office in New York under the local Berniecrats banner. Those are just a few. In my home state, you can go and search your home state and find some as well. Thank you guys so much for listening. Thank you for your support. We will see you next time.